They're coming, I promise you. I just did not get them done. Okay, so stay tuned for that. But don't worry about them over the break. Actually, take a break, and then we'll pick up again next week. Okay, where we ended last time, we took a brief look at the early Cold War. This ideological conflict between the communism of the Soviet Union and capitalism of the United States, but the larger Western capitalist nations. We briefly looked at this idea of containment, which was a policy formulated by George Kennan, this expert on the Soviet Union. This was in response to Truman, who again took over in 1945 after Roosevelt died in office in April of 1945. Truman was trying to figure out very quickly, because he was not informed as much by Roosevelt, how do you deal with the Soviet Union after the war was over? And he asked a number of experts, and Kennan responded with the long telegram, which basically suggested that the Soviets simply don't trust the West. And there were some legitimate reasons why they didn't trust the West, but some illegitimate reasons as well, right? And the point is that Kennan argued that the best thing to do is simply contain communism. Do not let it expand. Wherever it exists up at that point, and again, this would be primarily in Eastern Europe, simply because their tanks are there, right? That's as far as we're going to allow them to expand, but that's it, right? And containment is sort of creating a barrier to make sure that communism does not expand. Now, how you actually do that is going to be different from president to president. Kennan argued that the way to do it was simply to put, what is best about the West, that is what is good about democracy and what is good about particularly capitalism out there for the world to consume, right? And again, this was the Marshall Plan, this economic aid package to help rebuild rebuild Europe. And what made that possible was the financial structure of capitalism itself, right? So Kennan was suggesting that we put our best foot forward there to demonstrate to the world what is good about capitalism and to a lesser extent what is good about democracy. And these nations, as they are rebuilding after World War II, will turn to democracy, will turn to capitalism, will turn to the United States as a model for rebuilding their governments. Now, we ended with what happened in China last time. Kennan had made the argument that we can't be everywhere. We have to pick and choose what is most vital to U.S. national security. And one of the places he argued that was important was China. But our commitment to China was not terribly vast. We were there. We were helping, mostly with just finances, no troops or anything of that nature. But it was not a serious commitment, and the result was that China fell to the forces of the communist warlord Mao Zedong. Right? And the point is, in 1949, China became a communist country. And the lesson learned by the United States was, and I think I ended with this, just so we was what's now known as NSC 68, right? This is a National Security Council resolution which basically said that we will no longer make these decisions between what is crucial, what is sort of a peripheral or a perimeter area. All areas now will be understood as crucial because when we weren't committed, for example, in China, the communists were able to be successful. Now again, what is coming out of what has happened in China is largely unconnected to what is happening in the Soviet Union. They're both communist countries, but China and Russia are not allies. They're not friends. In fact, there are a lot of conflicts between these two countries, right? But we don't make those sort of distinctions. This is a fight against the spread of communism in all of its various formats. So we will now decide, we now make the decision, NSC 68, to contain communism everywhere. And just notice the context of the Korean conflict, or again, the Korean War. It began immediately after NSC 68. Right? This will be the first, in a significant way, the very first Cold War. Okay? So let's consider what happens in Korea. That's what we want to look at today, is the Korean conflict, or Korean War. First of all, we once again go back to the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. This was the conference. Remember, Potsdam is sort of near Berlin, and this was a meeting of all of the big three nations, the Soviet Union, United States, and England primarily, the winners of World War II, to determine and discuss the aftermath of the war. Now remember, at this point, this was also the conference where the decision to drop the atomic bomb was announced, or at least the decision to use a super weapon, and an ultimatum was given to Japan for unconditional surrender. So we looked at the Potsdam Conference from that context, but as I said, we revisited in the context of Korea, and here we are. The problem is, in Korea, which at this time is just one country, the Soviet Union has troops in the northern portion of the country, and the United States has troops in the southern portion of the country. And the concern on everybody's parts, because again, there's still that hostility of communism and capitalism. We need each other, right? This is still, the end of World War II, but we're still allies technically. There is some trepidation about what might happen when these forces, these communist, Russian or Soviet, I'll kind of use that term Soviet and Russian interchangeably, but technically they're Soviets, with the United States. What would happen when these armies met? And we didn't want to find out that answer. So we made sure that these armies never met by dividing the country in half at the 38th parallel. And this divides the country at this point not into North and South Korea, two independent countries, but Northern Korea and Southern Korea. It was a temporary partition, and it would last for 5 years, 1945 to 1950. And in 1950, we were supposed to sort of come back together and discuss, what we would do from that point forward. So it was kind of just divide the country up, let the war itself calm down. Remember, we still have to defeat Japan, so the war is still going on in Asia at this time. And ultimately, we'll kind of renegotiate a few years forward, all right? Now, it's also at the Potsdam Conference that we start talking about what's called spheres of influence diplomacy. What is a sphere of influence? This is the acknowledgement on both sides, the Soviet Union and the United States, that there are simply areas of the world that both countries influence, right? So Eastern Europe, for example, that is an acknowledged Soviet sphere of influence. Why? Because their tanks are there. They control it, right? They influence and largely will determine what's going to happen, right? The United States sphere of influence, and of course, it's never couched in this language of the United States. It would be Western nations, allied nations, NATO, things of this nature. But it's the United States influence here. Places like Western Europe, right? Places like the Western Hemisphere. These are places that it is acknowledged that the United States has influence over international relations in these parts of the world. So it's kind of an acknowledgement, right, that the Soviets have their areas of control, and the United States has their areas of control, right? And the point is not to try to challenge that nearly as much as it is trying to figure out a way to sort of coexist with each other, recognizing where we have strengths and where we have weaknesses, right? And Eastern Europe, again, is the particularly important one here because that's a Soviet sphere of influence. That was that concern over Eastern Europe that Stalin had at the end of, and during and at the end of World War II, because that had been a big launching ground for invasions by the West into Russia, or now the Soviet Union. Right? So what's going to happen in Northern Korea in this 5-year period, and what's going to happen in Southern Korea? Let's just briefly take a look at what's happening there. Well, in Northern Korea, and obviously they're going to become independent countries during this 5-year period, North Korea eventually. North Korea looked very similar to the Soviet Union in terms of political structure. First of all, a military dictatorship is established, and one man is put in power in Northern Korea, a man named Kim Jong-il. Does that name sound familiar, by the way? Yeah, his son, Kim Jong-il, is in power now in North Korea, right? And he is preparing for his son now to take over. So we also see then the establishment, more or less, of a hereditary military dictatorship. Kim Jong-il is absolutely unopposed in his domination of North Korean politics. There is only one political party in Northern Korea, and that is the Communist Party. So it's one-party rule, just as it is in the Soviet Union. This is a time of massive military buildup, massive troops, weapons, stockpiling of weapons. The Soviet Union is funneling all kinds of military hardware into Northern Korea. And this is a time where Northern Korea, under Kim Song-il, is going to experience what we would call purging, right? That's a very nice way to say executing or getting rid of all political opponents to the government, right? So this is a consolidation of power by the Soviet Union through this puppet dictator, Kim Song-il. Why is Kim Song-il in power? Because he cooperates and works with the Soviet Union. This is a sphere of influence, right? This is a sphere that the Soviets control, Northern Korea. All right? What's happening in Southern Korea at this time? Well, this is a slightly different situation. First of all, prior to World War II, if we go back to, say, the 1930s, for example, the Korean people, like most people, were very politically active people. Many political parties, vying for control through elections, etc. But the problem, of course, is that World War II happens. And during World War II, Korea, well, like China, like most of Southeast Asia, is invaded and occupied by the Japanese. Right? So Japanese occupation during World War II tends to put domestic issues on the back burner as you're now dealing with a foreign invader. Well, the most important and influential political party in Southern Korea during World War II was the Communist Party. The Communist Party. And why were they so important? Because they were the most aggressive at resisting Japanese occupation, right? Now, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Japan is militarily superior to Korea at this time. That's why they fairly easily conquered the country. But the point is, in terms of resistance to it, it's the Communist Party in Southern Korea that was most active, right? Now, most of these parties, again, they have to go underground. They have to sort of be silent. But the one party that was most active in resisting Japanese occupation, even if unsuccessfully, was the Communist Party. All right. So now, World War II ends. Japan has been defeated. The Japanese are out. This becomes a United States sphere of influence, Southern Korea. But what's going to happen is that political parties that had been sort of silenced during Japanese occupation become active again. Well, if we actually have free and fair elections in Southern Korea after World War II, what party is going to win? The Communist Party is going to win because they are the most popular party, because they were the most active in resisting Japanese occupation. They have the most popular support in Southern Korea. All right? So here's the problem. And this goes back to what is the definition of the Cold War. It is not democracy versus dictatorship. It is not democracy versus communism. It is capitalism versus communism. Because when it comes to spreading democracy in Southern Korea, we do not. We subvert democracy. We do not let free and fair elections take place because we know if we did, the communists would win. And the whole Cold War is about resisting or containing communist expansion. So, it's one of these sort of questions where, remember, we were talking about Eastern Europe. And during World War II, Roosevelt, again, he didn't really want to talk about what the war was going, what the world was going to be like after the war, because he knew one, not going to agree. And of course, Stalin had wanted to talk about Eastern Europe during the war, because Stalin knew that's when he had the most leverage, right? When we needed him to fight the Nazis. And so Roosevelt agreed, didn't have a choice, but he agreed to let the Soviet Union occupy Eastern Europe as a Soviet sphere of influence, under the conditions that free and fair elections would take place. Now, again, nobody is going to vote for an occupying force. I don't care what the ideology is, nobody likes being occupied by anybody. So in Eastern Europe, when the communists run for election, guess what? They lose. Which means that free and fair elections are not going to take place in Eastern Europe, right? In fact, we had in Czechoslovakia, for example, right after the war, this is in Poland. We have the president of Poland was elected. Why was he elected? Because he's an anti-communist. And what happened to this guy? Well, he somehow flew out a 4-story window. Right? He was executed by the Soviets. They're not going to allow anti-communist political parties to take power because it would challenge communist occupation. Right? So we were very critical of the Soviets because they did not honor these commitments to free and fair elections. And then when we get to Southern Korea, what did the United States do? The exact same thing. We subverted democracy because we were not going to allow communists to run governments that was a sphere of influence. It was not going to work, right? So again, when we say that this Cold War is not about democracy, this is an example of that. We're happy to promote democracy when it's in our interest, but this is the problem with democracy. If you actually give people the right or power to determine for themselves what they want, what do you do when they choose something that is contrary to your interests? That's the problem, right? This is kind of one of the problems we have in the Middle East today, right? So what happens is, instead of democracy and elections, we put in place a man named Syngman Rhee in power in Southern Korea because, and this is where we're going to do this time and time again, if you're reading through the Kinzer book, you're seeing what is the one criteria we demand of anybody that's put in power for a country that's a sphere of influence for the United States. You must be a rabid anti-communist. And that's pretty much the only job description we care about is you must be able to work with the United States and prevent communism from expansion. And that's exactly what Syngman Rhee was. He was a rabid anti-communist. And that's why he's put in power, and democracy is subverted in Southern Korea. Okay, we now get into January of 1950. And the Secretary of State, this is Truman, right, still president. He won election in 1948. Not that anybody expected him to win that election. That was one of the surprise elections that he ended up winning. But he did win, and his Secretary of State is a man named Dean Acheson. And in January of 1950, Acheson, as Secretary of State, gave a speech to the White House Press Club. So it's sometimes called the Press Club speech. But he was basically outlining a policy of areas in the Pacific that the United States would absolutely go to war to defend, no questions asked. Right? And he sort of drew a semicircle, right? We sort of see the United States here, Asia here. He drew a semicircle around a couple of countries. The Aleutian Islands, coming off the Alaskan, in the north of Alaska. Japan, the Japanese home islands, and the Philippines. Right? And he said, basically, he drew this line in the Pacific and said, these countries, that is countries on this side, our side of that line, we will absolutely go to war to protect, to defend. No questions asked. Which country was not included? Korea. Right? And this is where, historians are going to suggest that this may be suggested to Northern Korea and the Soviets that we were not committed to Southern Korea, at least the way we were to these other countries. Maybe our commitment was not as strong. And this is going to be the provocation then for the Northern Korean forces under Kim Song-il to attack South Korea. Okay? Now, does this mean, I guess the question becomes, NSC 68, we're going to not make choices, we're going to defend, we'll maintain containment everywhere. Well, what happens is there's a new organization created at the end of in World War II in 1945 called the United Nations. So the United Nations is going to get involved in the Korean War, the Korean conflict, in a way that is unusual for U.S. foreign interest. And here's what I mean by it. I'll come back to United Nations in just a moment here. My point is that we are still committed to South Korea, but we're going to do it through the United Nations, not just the United States alone. Okay? All right. So when we gave this speech that apparently it suggested to the Soviets and Northern Korea that we maybe were not quite committed to Korea as we were to other Asian countries, this perhaps created a sense of weakness, and the Soviets and Northern Korea exploited this weakness. And on June 25th, 1950, Northern Korean forces overran the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. this begins the Korean conflict or the Korean War, right? Again, is it a war? Is it a conflict? Is it a police action? Technically, it's not a war. Why? Because what does it take for it to be a war, by the way, officially? Who declares wars? Congress declares war, not presidents. So we have not technically been involved in a war since World War II. Technically. Have we been involved in conflict since World War II? Yeah, a few. Just a few. A lot, actually, right? And here's one of them. So we use the word war, but again, technically this is an international police action or conflict, right? June 25th, 1950. I don't know if I guess you can see these maps pretty good here. Here's the 38th parallel right here on the left-hand map. And North Korean communist forces, backed by the Soviet Union, right, attacked South Korea. And notice how successful they were. They went all the way down. Here's the city of Pusan in the southeast corner of the peninsula, right? And basically, almost all of the southern portion of the peninsula was conquered by the North Koreans, except for this area right around Pusan. It's sometimes referred to as the Pusan perimeter, right? That is, there was complete domination by the Northern Koreans as they took advantage of this, again, perhaps weakness on the United States with the press club speech. Okay, so South Korea is completely overrun very quickly by Northern Korean forces. This begins the conflict. Okay. Now, how does the United States respond to this? This is where we get to meet a very interesting character. He's one of the more dynamic military leaders in U.S. military history, General Douglas MacArthur. Now, MacArthur had actually made a name for himself back during World War I, so he's been around for a very long time. He was one of the most famous military leaders coming out of World War II. He is the one who accepted the Japanese surrender at the end of World War II. He was the leader of the United States Army during the attack on the Japanese territories in the Pacific. And he's probably one of the most popular personalities coming out of World War II, right? He is really viewed as a hero, right? In this military command of an occupation of the Japanese. He's the one that wrote quite a bit of the Japanese Constitution that we more or less forced on the Japanese after World War II as well, right? Now, the United Nations is going to be involved in this conflict, right? So it's not that the United States is not committed to containing communism in SC 68, but in this particular instance, notice that because there was an agreement back to the Potsdam Conference, this is an international conflict, not just U.S. interest here, that we can't simply just attack North Korea, right? So we're going to go through the United Nations, and the case is made to the United Nations that there is a limited objective here. It's a limited conflict. Our objective through the United Nations is simply to liberate South Korea, to push back the communist North Koreans. That's the objective that the United Nations agreed to. MacArthur is put in power, put in charge of this force, and again, while it's a United Nations operation, it is mostly a U.S. operation, mostly U.S. soldiers, right? Again, it's an international force, but most of it is American. But the point is that it was a limited conflict, simply to liberate South Korea. But MacArthur doesn't do limited conflicts, okay? So here's what MacArthur does, right? First of all, he's a brilliant military strategist, no question about that. This is where now remember, North Korean forces have pushed all the way down to the southern tip of the peninsula around Pusan. Instead of simply attacking from Pusan and going all the way up the peninsula, he actually, quite interestingly, led an amphibious assault sort of in the middle of the country at a town called Incheon. Incheon. This is famous Incheon landing. And the point, of course, was, and I mean he was right, is that the North Koreans had really overextended themselves very quickly. And if you could sort of attack in the middle of their forces, which is exactly what he did, approximately right at the 38th parallel here, right? If you could do that, you might actually be able to divide their forces and systematically cut them, isolate them from each other, and bring this resolution to an end pretty quickly, right? And in fact, that's exactly what he almost did, right? What do I mean by that? He very quickly, you can see with the green arrows here, not only captured South Korea very easily, but began pushing the North Koreans back a little bit further than the 38th parallel, all the way back, and you can see how far he goes, almost to China. Almost to China. Now, this is the problem. This is not what the United Nations agreed to, right? The point was to liberate South Korea. He did that very quickly, in just a matter of months. But MacArthur is one of these guys who believe it's, while we're here, right? Let's deal with the big threat. What is the big threat? It's not North Korea. What's the big threat? It's China itself. Remember, NSC 68, fall of communism, or communist China, and MacArthur actually, remember who is in charge here? Truman, exactly. The president is in charge. Civilians are in charge, right? Truman is the one, as commander-in-chief, that runs this operation. But MacArthur is publicly, in the newspapers, calling for aerial bombing of China, major Chinese cities, while Truman is trying to negotiate a settlement to what was supposed to be a limited conflict in Korea. Now, as MacArthur's forces are driving north to China, right, he comes across, it's what the boundary here between North Korea and China is the Yalu River. And by the way, MacArthur's calling for a campaign against China without consulting Truman. The Chinese respond. And I'm sort of paraphrasing their language very diplomatically here. They basically said, look, if MacArthur even puts his little toe in the Yalu River, we're going to get involved in this conflict. Well, MacArthur did more than just put his little toe. He basically was doing cannonballs into the Yalu River, right? He is basically, he's pushing all the way to Korea. And how does China respond? 300,000 Chinese soldiers then push across the Chinese border into North Korea, pushing back UN forces all the way out of North Korea back to South Korea. And we now start this whole thing over again. And for the next 2.5 years, remember this is 1950 to 53, right? A 3.5-year conflict that should have been over in about 6 to 8 months. Because MacArthur got too close to China, China comes in and turns what was supposed to be a limited conflict, mission accomplished after a few months at the Incheon landing, into a 2.5-year war. And when this whole thing is done, by the way, MacArthur was fired, right, as he should have been, and removed from office. When the whole thing is done, the next few years are simply to do what? To get back to where we were at the very beginning of this conflict at the 38th parallel. Right? Now, why was this war, conflict, police action, why was it fought? It was fought in the name of the Cold War, right? Communism, capitalism. That's why this war was fought. So when we say the Cold War it's a Cold War by definition because the two main adversaries, the United States and Soviet Union, don't go to war with each other, well, we actually went to war with each other many times in many places indirectly through other countries. It's a proxy war. And that's what we're going to see time and time again. Vietnam is the same situation, right? So in the aftermath of this war, it absolutely reaffirmed to foreign policy experts that NSC 68 was correct. If you give the communists any sort of weakness or opening, they will exploit it. They will attempt to exploit it at least. And that was the point, right? Acheson gave this speech. It seemed to be that we maybe were a little weak in Korea, and they exploited that weakness by attacking and starting this conflict, right? We also start to see that this is a preview of the Vietnam conflict a few decades into the future. By the way, as we are finishing this conflict in 1953, something we're going to talk about later when we get to Vietnam, but the first Indo-Chinese Communist French War is beginning in 1954 in Vietnam. We'll come back to that, right? So again, these things are not unrelated to each other. They build upon each other, right? We also start to see that Western Europe is going to be stockpiled with weapons, right? Because once again, the line in the sand for the United States is Europe, East and West Europe, right? And that we will absolutely maintain, no questions asked, right? So what we're going to see here when it comes to the Korean War is that after 3 years of fighting, we more or less are right back where we started. The country is divided at the 38th parallel. And technically, is this conflict technically over? No. Why? Now again, they're not. It's not a shooting war. Although I believe they might have started shooting at each other just in the last couple of days, if I remember correctly. I think North Korea launched some artillery at South Korea, so we'll see where this goes. But there was never an official peace treaty. And that's what you must have in these conflicts. So again, this is why there's tremendous hostility on the North and the South in Korea right now, because this conflict technically was never officially resolved. No peace treaty was ever signed. Right? And now it seems, again, particularly with a lunatic like Kim Jong-il in power, we may be on the verge of another conflict in Korea. But I think that that probably is not the case. But we'll see. Okay, so that's a brief look at the Korean conflict. Once again, it's a Cold War war, right? Indirectly fighting communism, capitalism, United States, Soviet Union. But we don't fight each other, we fight indirectly. Okay? Okay, so I want to start introducing a couple of topics here. We're going to continue foreign policy and Cold War. But I also, at the same time, want to look at some domestic issues here. And I thought we would take a look at least a brief look at a film. The next big topic we're going to continue. Now, again, this war ended, Korean War ended, in 1953, and as we said, it was Truman that begins the war, but we have a new president elected in 1952, Dwight Eisenhower. He was the Allied Supreme Commander. We're going to talk more about Eisenhower later in terms of foreign policy and how he's fighting the Cold War. He takes a very new, different strategy for fighting the Cold War. But I want to look at some of the domestic issues with Eisenhower today, and this is the beginning of our look at the civil rights movement of the 1950s, all right? And particularly the murder of Emmett Till, all right? So we're going to be doing two things here. Throughout the next couple of lectures, we're going to continue foreign policy throughout the Cold War, and we're going to start looking at domestic issues of the civil rights movement. Now, as I said when we started this this topic on the Cold War, the civil rights movement, notice the context of when this actually gets up and running and active. It's in the aftermath of World War II, and particularly it is in the Cold War that the civil rights movement will make its most important headway, right? And that's not a coincidence. If you are going to promote what is good about the United States around the world so that countries will turn to our way of thinking, capitalism, and to a lesser extent democracy, it doesn't really do you any favors to show African Americans being, having fire hoses launched at them and police dogs, chewing on them, right? So we're going to see that there's going to have to be some concessions made here at home with the civil rights movement in order to fight the larger Cold War, right? Those things are connected. So I want to take a look at least an introduction of the film here. And maybe before I start the film, let me just sort of set it up a little bit. It's about maybe 30 minutes or so. In 1896, we have a Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson. And I believe I mentioned this just briefly in the Reconstruction lecture at the beginning of the semester. But basically, this was a Supreme Court case which said segregation, that is, separating people simply based on the color of their skin, did not violate the Constitution. It was constitutional. It was accepted. As long as, right, you could separate people, but you had to provide equal service, separate but equal. And as we know, it's always separate, but it's never equal, right? So segregation was constitutionally reaffirmed in 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson. Well, now we're in 1954, right? So this is right at the end, again, Korea ended in 1953, moving into the mid-1950s. And 1954, we have a new Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education. Now, we're going to come back to this in the course of the Civil Rights Movement, but let me just sort of briefly summarize what this court case was about. Brown v. Board of Education overturned the constitutionality of segregation in one area, public schools. Public schools. So what Brown v. Board of Education did was make it unconstitutional to separate people, segregate people in public schools. And that's it. That's all it did. But this is why it's so important. Because our court system is based on precedent. If this is unconstitutional in public schools, we'll see that you now have a legal sort of leg to stand on here to go after segregation in other public areas like restaurants and like department stores and buses and bus lines, whether they're interstate or city buses, right? So Brown v. Board of Education gave a legal framework to challenge segregation across the South. All right. However, when we talk about civil rights movement, that idea of movement is more than just Supreme Court cases. It's more than just lawyers and judges in the Constitution. Movement implies that there is emotion, there is feeling, there is anger, there is resentment, right? That is, something has to get people so motivated that they act. And I would suggest to you that it's not so much Brown v. Board of Education, although that's obviously important. It gives you the legal argument to challenge segregation, but it's the murder of Emmett Till in 1955 that is that emotional spark to start a movement, right? And I'm going to show you a brief story about the murder of Emmett Till. And let me just say that there are some images shown in this film of Emmett Till's corpse after they found him, right? And these are quite disturbing. And if you're disturbed by that, let me just remind you that these images were printed in magazines, particularly Jet magazine, and shown to the whole country. And it is in the aftermath of what happened in Mississippi in 1955, which, well, not to tell you too much, but Emmett Till was from the North. He's from Chicago. And this is the problem, is that when a Northerner came to the South and this tragedy, this brutal slaying happened, it's going to come back beyond the South. It's going to go back to not just the North, but to the world. And the point is that what happened to Emmett Till is shocking, not to Southerners, because this was common. It's shocking to the rest of the world, which had turned a blind eye to what was going on in the South. And that's where movement begins, when it gets beyond the South. So we'll take a look at this and then maybe talk about it afterwards. And I'll turn the lights on in just a second. Yeah, fast forward just a little bit. This is just an introduction to the whole series. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Eyes on the Prize, but that's what this comes from. So this is just a brief introduction of the entire series, and then we'll get to this particular episode, The Murder of Emmett Till, 1955.
Segregated. It was our social system, our way of keeping blacks and whites apart. custom and by law, most blacks were servants, laborers, tenant farmers, went to separate poor schools, lived in separate poor housing. Segregation was the context for black lives throughout the country, but especially in the South, a complete environment, socially and psychologically.
Listen, for a long time, I had the idea that a man with white skin was superior because it appeared to me that he had everything. And I figured if God would justify the white man having everything, that God put him in a position to be the best.
If you're born into a system that's wrong, whether it's a slave system or whether it's a segregated system, you take it for granted. And I was born into a system that was segregated and denied blacks the right to vote, also denied women the right to vote. And I took it for granted. Nobody told me any different. Nobody said it was strange, unusual, or wasn't my Gulf State.
Segregation had its rules, and Southern blacks knew that if they didn't obey them, if they didn't step aside to let a white man pass, or if a black man looked too closely at a white woman, the system could be enforced by violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terrorism to uphold white supremacy and were an ever-present symbol of intimidation. But there were always blacks who fought against segregation. Many ministers preached equality, and black unions and organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People worked for it for decades through speeches, demonstrations, and court cases.
American News brings you our people's contribution to America and freedom.
World War II had an enormous impact on black hopes for change. Black Americans fought and died in a segregated U.S. Army, but they saw a larger, unsegregated world. They saw their own power as they fought and as some were trained as officers and specialists. And they came back with a new sense of themselves.
I spent 3 years overseas in New Guinea, and I became an officer during that period. I had been eager to exercise authority. So when we got out, it was just one more step to say, well, look, we aren't going to take this anymore.
The South they came back to was determined to resist change, and most of the nation was not ready to hear black demands for justice. Then, in the early 1950s, after years of carefully planned litigation, the NAACP brought these demands to the Supreme Court. The test cases were set in schools. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. It called into question the whole system of segregation.
It was quite a shock to Southerners to be told that the way they had been running their affairs for many, many years was no longer acceptable to the nation as a whole. And many of the older crowd of white Southerners felt that they came of an ancestry that were founders of the Republic, and they knew the Constitution and customs and laws of the country as well as anybody else.
The South resisted desegregation with legal and illegal delays. It would take years before the Supreme Court's decision would be implemented in any meaningful way, but it had one immediate effect.
I think that the greatest impact of the Brown decision was on the black community itself. It was a statement to the black community that they had a friend, so to speak, the Supreme Court. And so it emboldened the communities of blacks around the country to move forward. to secure their own rights.
The change began slowly, especially in rural areas. Blacks knew they could still lose their livelihood or their lives if they pushed whites too fast. But step by step, the change began, first with small acts of personal courage. In September 1955, an old man named Mose Wright took that remarkable first step. His story starts at the Tallahatchie River in Money, Mississippi. Here, the body of Mose Wright's nephew, Emmett Till, was found, way down in the waters. Two local men were arrested and charged with the murder. They were white. Emmett Till was black. Till had come down from Chicago to visit his relatives.
This is Mose Wright. I am the uncle of Emmett Louis Till. Sunday morning about 2:30, someone called at the door. And I said, "Who is it?" And he said, "This is Mr. Brian. I want to talk with you and the boy." And when I opened the door, there was a man standing with a pistol in one hand and a flashlight in the other hand. And he asked me, did I have two boys there from Chicago? I told him I have. And he said, I want the boy that done all that talk. And then marched him to the car, and he asked someone there, was this is the right boy? And the answer was, here. And he drove toward Money.
And I found out about it 9:30 Sunday morning. I was in bed. I got up, called my mother, and I got the news because every decision I had ever made or every prep that I had ever been in, it took her to get me out of it. And I took that one to Mama too because I didn't know what to do. Mother told me to come right over and she would start making calls. And I got over there as quickly as I could make it. And that wasn't very long.
By this time, everyone in Money knew what had happened. Emmett Till had broken one of segregation's rules. He talked fresh to a white woman in a store. He was only 14. He was a northerner, and he didn't understand.
He went into the store to buy some candy. Before then, he had showed the boys around his age. He had some picture of some white kids that he had graduated from. That was, female and male. So he told the boys down there, hey, you got around the store? It must have been around about maybe 10 to 12, youngsters around there. That the girls was his girlfriend, So one of the local boys said, hey, there's a girl in that store there, so I bet you want to go in there and talk to her, So he went in there to get some candy. So when he was leaving out the store, after buying the candy, he told us, say, bye, baby. And the next thing I knew, one of the boys came up to me and say, man, you got a crazy cousin. He just went in there and said bye to that white woman. And that's when this man, I was playing checker with this older man, I guess he must have been around about 60 or 70. He jumped straight up and said, boy, say, y'all better get out of here. Say, that lady come out of that store and blow y'all brains out.
Wednesday, the sheriff came and told me they had found the body at Phillip and wanted me to go and identify the body, which I did. And we found the body, which didn't have on any clothes at all. The body was so badly damaged that we couldn't hardly just tell who he was. But he happened to have on a ring with his initials. And that cleared it up.
The body was shipped home, back north to Chicago, where Mamie Till Bradley insisted on an open casket funeral. So all the world can see, she said, what they did to my boy. Jet magazine showed Till's corpse, beaten, mutilated, shot through the head. A generation of black people would remember the horror of that photo.
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me. And if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Roy Bryant, husband of the woman in the store, and J.W. Milam, her brother-in-law, were arrested for the murder of Emmett Till. The trial was held in nearby Sumner, Mississippi. Black organizations like the NAACP and the Black Press were especially interested, and they worked hard to keep the case in the news, to make an example of Southern racism for the world.
It was because it was a boy that they went there. They had to prove that they were superior. They had to prove it by taking away a 14-year-old boy. You know, it's in the virus, it's in the blood of the Mississippian. He can't help it.
I'd like for the NAACP or any colored organization anywhere to know that we are here giving all parties a free trial and intend to give a fair and impartial trial. And we don't need the help of the NAACP, and we don't intend for them to help. We never have any trouble until some of our southern niggas go up north and the NAACP talks to them and they come back home.
I had covered the courts in many areas of this country, but the Till case was unbelievable. I mean, I just didn't get the sense of being in a courtroom. It was, first place, segregated. The black press sat at a bridge table far off from the court, and the boy's mother came down. They sat her there at the bridge table with us. Plus, the United States Congressman at that time, Diggs, he came down, and I was the one that got him in because the sheriff wouldn't let him in. He said to the deputy that he called over, he said, "This nigga here said there's a nigga outside who says that he's a congressman, and he has corresponded with the judge, and the judge had told him to come on down, and he would let him in." He said, but the sheriff won't let him in, so he's sending his card up there. So this guy said, "A nigger congressman?" And he said, "That's what this nigga said." I said, "My God, I have never seen anything like this in my life."
There was, of course, a lot of buzzing when I entered the place and was placed in that area. And I think the judge said something about, yeah, have that boy come on up here and sit down over here with these news reporters, you know.
What do you intend to do here today?
To answer any questions that the attorneys might ask me to answer. To the best.
How do you think it could possibly be a help to us?
I don't know. I mean, just by answering whatever questions that they ask me.
Do you have any evidence bearing on this case?
I do know that this is my son.
The defense argued that the body found tied to the cotton gin fan in the river was so disfigured that it could not be identified as Emmett Till. The trial took 5 long, hot days. Because of threats to his life, the prosecution's star witness, Mose Wright, was kept hidden out of state.
Will you go back to Mississippi to testify in the kidnap trial?
Sure, I'll go back because I promised the judge I'll do that. So if I live, I'm going back to testify. And after the trial, well, I'm through the city. Whatever, didn't have my part in the city. I'm through it. I want nothing to that.
At the time, I really didn't realize how brave my grandfather Mose Wright was, you know. But after I got older, I realized that he was a brave man. He was a mighty brave man to travel back down there, you know, among all those hostile peoples and testify and get up in court and point his finger at a white man and accuse him of murder.
He was called upon to testify as to could he see anybody in the courtroom, identify anybody in that courtroom that had come to his house that night and got the Emmett Till out. He stood up, and there was a tension in the courtroom, and he says in his broken language, "Darhy."
Darhy, there he is. Other black witnesses came forward too. Their courage made no difference in Sumner, Mississippi. As the trial ended, a defense lawyer told the jury he was, quote, sure every last Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to free these men. It took the jury an hour to find the men not guilty.
How do you folks feel now that it's all over? Roy, how about you? I'm just glad it's over with. J.W.? I am too. Mrs. Bryant,
You're fine.
how about you, Mrs. Milam? Did you expect this verdict? Well, I was hoping, Lord.
Well, the whole trial was just a farce, but the verdict was the one that I had expected to be given.
Months later, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam told their story of the night of August 28th for $4,000 to reporter William Bradford Huey.
Milam was startled at the belligerent attitude, or the fact that young Till didn't appear to be afraid of him. Now, he'd gone and got him out of bed and had him in the back of the truck, and young Till never realized the danger he was in. I'm quite sure that he never thought these two men would kill him. And, or maybe he's just in such a strange environment, he really just doesn't know what he's up against. And it seems, to the rational mind today, it seems impossible that they could have killed him. But J.W. Milam looked up at me and said, well, when he told me about this white girl he had, he says, my friend, that's what this war is about down here now. He says, that's what we got to fight to protect. And he says, I just looked at him and I said, boy, you ain't going to never see the sun come up again.
For much of Southern history, lynching had been an ordinary story. Race killings were down by the 1950s, but over the years, there had been more than 500 documented lynchings in Mississippi alone.
Watch your eyes.
affected the
So this is the brief look at the story of the murder of Emmett Till. You know, it's interesting. I'm sitting in the back just watching. I'm always interested in the reactions of students when they showed the picture of Till, which is just hard to imagine. I heard like maybe one or two short breaths there, but when that white cop, right, Strider, said the N-word, the whole room did, right? As, this white man saying the N-word, right? It's kind of shocking. I don't know if you guys are just used to seeing violence or not or whatever. We're not used to white people using the N-word, right? But again, it shows you how far we've come here. But just keep in mind, this is 1955, right? This is your grandparents' generation. This is not that long ago, right? 50, 60 years ago, right? This is the first, sort of major event, arguably, that's going to crystallize into a movement, right? And again, that shock in America when we saw what Southern segregation was all about, right? Again, Emmett Till was not the first person that this had happened to. We just at the very end, I don't know if you caught that or not, 500 lynchings in Mississippi alone, right? Who knows how many undocumented ones, right? So we obviously are going to explore this later on throughout the rest of the course here. We'll kind of keep coming back to the ongoing civil rights movement of the 50s and into the 1960s and 70s as we continue looking at the Cold War as well. These two paths are continuing at the same time. Okay, so we'll come back to this and the Cold War after the break. We're going to get out just a little bit early today. You guys enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday. Look for those quizzes after Thanksgiving. Right?